photos today. Okay, so this is going to be another character creation one, but it is specifically going to be about kind of what I'm going to call like difficult character concepts or just trickier ones, because it got me thinking about in our one game, one player is playing a goblin paladin who's like an immortal, like several thousand years old, but they don't have access to all their memories, and like a huge chunk of their power is kind of like sealed off or something. Theoretically, nobody's really sure what's going on with them. And I think that is inherently a pretty difficult character concept to work with, especially the way it's been built. Because in that game, that character kind of lacks a really defined social role in the group. Like all the other characters have pretty defined places in the group, like not hierarchy, but like basically what everybody does. Like my character Raskus is kind of like the Captain America leader type. Not the most charismatic, not the most persuasive, but he knows how to talk to people, especially in like a formal setting. He's also more of the tactician and lays into combat a bit more than all the other characters. And we've got like the Kenku rogue, who's the rogue type, very deceptive, very sneaky, very break into houses, thieves' tools type, the standard. We've got a bard that does like tons of really easy persuasion and just lots of skills. And then we have a druid that's also hasn't really defined themselves too much outside of being a druid. But then for Mildred, this goblin paladin who's actually an immortal, there isn't a whole lot for them to do. And one of the initial concepts that the DM and that player came up with was that, like, in any situation where the character, like, kind of attempts to remember something, like, the player just makes a statement, like, oh yeah, I was in this town, like, 450 years ago. This guy was here, this thing, blah, blah, blah. They just remember some stuff. And then the player essentially, like, rolls, like, a D100 or a D something, just rolls some dice to determine whether that's actually true or not. And I feel like that mechanic isn't quite good enough. It doesn't work well enough because it relies on the player to kind of come up with something first and then roll to see if it's true. So what has ended up happening is all the other characters kind of treat this, like, basically like most of what Mildred says as, we don't know if that's true, that could be garbage, so we can't really do anything with it. And a lot of what this character says ends up essentially being non sequiturs that don't really have any impact. And, like, I wonder if instead this could be, like, flipped. Like, anytime the player wants to make a statement like this, like, oh yeah, I was here like 400 years ago, then instead they make a roll to determine it first. Like, you do the roll first and determine, like, yeah, whatever you're about to say is true or is not. And then that can color the player's description, and also give the other players maybe a little bit of a hint. But it can be easier to to lean into that, because if it fails, then it can just be a non sequitur joke and nobody really cares, and it doesn't really matter. But if it does succeed, then the player knows, like, oh hey, the player knows this is true. The character doesn't, but the player does. So they can lean into it a bit more and try to offer something a bit more concrete than just a generic statement about how they were here a long time ago. That the other players can't really do anything with. So I think that might be better, or the DM also suggested a list of things that are definitely concrete in addition to this kind of mechanic. Something else that I suggested to the player is, like, for a bit more of this, like, kind of touchy recall, every morning when they wake up, their proficiency swap around. That could be another mechanic, but this also brings up another thought that I had about this type of thing. Like, once this character does eventually sort of complete or like get farther into this arc of them figuring out their lost memories and the nature of their curse and all this stuff, if they get more of their memories, they're going to have a ton more experience. Like, just all of a sudden. So, how would that work? And I think before that, another possibility is that, like, you know, maybe once or twice a day, a certain amount of times per day, for example, or just whenever, the player can try to recall a skill or some information, and for a certain amount of rolls per day, they can maybe maybe they have to succeed at that, like, long-term history check first, and then if they succeed at it, then they can treat this roll as if they have proficiency, either half proficiency, or maybe even expertise, depending on how good that, like, long-term recall. I'm just going to call it, like, immortal memory, an immortal memory roll. Depending on how good that roll is, they can get a bonus to whatever skill check this is. I think that could work well enough. But then, if you use that mechanic, and then once the character starts to get more of their memories in a more concrete way, do they just get these proficiencies more frequently? I'd say probably. And that would be powerful, but it would be farther into the campaign, and it would help this character just have more skill proficiencies and be able to do more things. I think that could be a reasonable mechanic instead of just like a big history roll. Basically, have it like a contingent proficiency or expertise. I think that could work. But yeah, once the character gets their memories back, then that's a touchy subject to try to handle that. But in addition to just this character, there are other character concepts that I've run into that I think are inherently more difficult depending on exactly what you're playing them in. Like this immortal type of character. This type of character could work extremely well in a one-shot, where, you know, your character just has proficiency in fucking everything, has tons of old knowledge, and in a one-shot, who cares? Like, yeah, I remember this, yeah, like, you know, it's a one-shot, who cares? But in a long campaign, you have to temper that a bit more. And you can't, like, this character can't just know everything for free. Likewise, in another one-shot, another friend of mine played one of those, like, 2 souls, 1 body character. And I may have mentioned it before on this channel. But in a one-shot, I feel like that concept doesn't work as well. There's not enough room to really explore it. Because, one, you have 2 characters to characterize instead of 1, which is all like doubling that kind of load, because it's already difficult to characterize a character quickly enough, especially in a one-shot. Because, you know, for one-shots, you usually have more dramatic, straightforward character types, usually. But in an actual campaign, you have a lot more time to kind of play into either of those characters and really lay them out. But in a one-shot, you just don't have that much time. So that, like, those two concepts, like the immortal character and the 2 souls, 1 body character, Like, the Immortal works pretty well in a one-shot, just as a base concept. Like, you can always tweak these to fit either one more readily. Like, the Immortal works better in a one-shot, and the Two Souls, One Body works better in an actual campaign. And, you know, there's tons of more character concepts that you might be able to think of, but sometimes a character concept might be really cool, but it might not work in a campaign as well without some tweaking, or it might not work in a one-shot without some tweaking. Like, a character I played in a level 20 one-shot, he was a Blue Dragonborn Tempest Cleric. This was like a kind of superhero-y type one-shot, and if I were to, like, in that one-shot, he's at the pinnacle of his power. He has all these, like, he's a blacksmith, he has this, like, artifact-level weapon he created himself with the blessing of his god. All this stuff. Whereas in a campaign, like in that one shot, there's not a whole lot for me to dig into. He's just like, he's just he represents his god, and he's an avatar of the storm, and that's kind of it. Whereas if you take this character into a campaign, there's a lot more to play around with that concept. Like, both because you start off a lot weaker than that level 20 version. And, like, something I was thinking about at the end was, maybe this character is actually a kobold, but through his god, like, he becomes a dragonborn, or maybe he can temporarily become a dragonborn or something. And in a one-shot, there's not a whole lot you can do with a concept like that, besides, like, okay, threat's over, I used all my spell slots, now I'm back to being a kobold until tomorrow, like something like that. But in a campaign, you can play into that. Like, while he's in his dragonborn state, he's stern and confident and very, like, stoic and powerful. But whenever he uses all his magic and he reverts back to being a kobold, he's cowardly and fearful and high-pitched, squeaky voice, whatever. But, like, just, there's inherently some difficulties with certain concepts, depending on the situation. And depending on the game they're being played in. Yeah, that's it for this character concept video, or character creation video.